Fritz Knack and Joe Friedberg said to the Minnesota Supreme Court there was no fraud in this election. No fraud. Those are the people who had their sleeves up working every day were desperately trying to find fraud.
Was that before the Minnesota Majority Report on Felons, yes or no? Yes or no?
Am I in a court of law? I have to answer questions, yes or no, Your Honor?
Well, I'd like to have an answer.
The exclusion of certain voters is the premise of what photo ID is all about. We should, in my view, be very hesitant to change our Constitution. We should be even more hesitant when the change will restrict the right of some to vote. For at least the last 3 presidential elections, no state has had a higher level of civic participation, and I'm darn proud of that. In the 14 years I've been Hennepin County Attorney, there have been no cases of voter impersonation. There have been no organized fraud or manipulation of voting. None. Justice Alan Page declared that the photo ID amendment is a, quote, classic bait and switch, end quote. Justice Paul Anderson, in the same case, declared this amendment to be, quote, inaccurate, misleading, and deceptive, end quote. These aren't a couple of partisan hacks. These are Minnesota Supreme Court justices, judges who serve in our highest court and uphold our Constitution and laws. Furthermore, by putting this into the Constitution instead of by statute, we are locking ourselves in. Again, former State Senator Fritz Knack and I are in agreement. Technologies are already changing for verifying voters, but we won't be able to adopt these changes if we adopt this amendment. Minnesota has always addressed voting in a bipartisan manner, but for the first time in our history, we have outside interests and an overly aggressive Republican legislature jamming this poorly written constitutional amendment down our throats. Requiring a photo ID would also profoundly reduce Election Day registration. This is one of the great innovations pioneered in Minnesota by a truly bipartisan effort. In the 2008 election, more than 540,000 people registered on Election Day.
And what Democratic Senator Chris Dodd of Connecticut said when we passed the Help America Vote Act in 2002 was the goal of this bipartisan legislation is to do 2 things that we can accomplish at the same time. We can make it easy to vote, and we can make it hard to cheat. We can do both. So if there are a few people, and it's far fewer than the 10% of the population the Brennan Center discovered in a flawed telephone poll, and it's far fewer than 25% of African Americans, they preposterously claim lack an ID. How patronizing to say that 25% of African Americans can't obtain an ID. I estimate that the groups fighting voter ID, given their publicity costs and their legal bills and everything, have spent well over $10 million nationwide on this effort. Probably a lot more. If they spent a small portion of that, combining with other people of goodwill in getting people an ID, we could solve the problem. And there would be no debate. The Pew Research Center, an impeccably nonpartisan group, estimates there are between 1.8 million and 2 million dead people on our voter rolls. Now look, I think we should honor our dead, but I do not believe in representation without respiration. 1,100 felons did vote illegally. That's called fraud in the 2008 election. If it's not fraud, what would you call it? Bottom line, we have 2 civil rights in this country. The first civil right is to make sure that no one is prevented from voting. I do not believe in exclusion. I agree with the district attorney. But there's a second civil right that each and every one of you have when it comes to voting. It is the right not to have your vote canceled out, to be disenfranchised because someone is voting who's illegal. Much of voter fraud can never be detected. It is like an iceberg. 1/10 above the surface, 9/10 below the surface. We are doing people a favor by getting them an ID. Because if you don't have an ID, you can't fully function in the mainstream of American life.
Well, let's talk about cost for a second. I appreciated Peter, the architect of the study by Mitch Pearlstein's group, suggested that there's not much cost. The Citizens for Election Integrity, partially run by Professor David Schultz, that many of us know, estimate the cost between $50 and $150 million. We know there's going to be some costs, and to suggest there'll be none is ludicrous. The provisional ballot process requires a good deal of additional expense.
If we spend, say, $43 billion, that's about the right number, in a biennial operating costs. And we do end up spending $100 million plus, although our study argues a much smaller number. Isn't that a small price to pay for one of the principles that I'd like to have govern this discussion, which is integrity? Voters should be confident that their election systems deter and detect fraud.
Nice to have accurate voting, but I'd like to point out some what I consider to be much more important voting problems. Low voter
It's got to be
turnout.
a question because we're up against a tight.
I have to